The Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ welcomes you. Join our Sunday morning adult Bible class as we study the Book of Galatians. Paul tells us of the one gospel, how faith justifies us, and how does that justification save us and fulfill the law of Christ.
We're glad to have you here. We are in the Book of Galatians, so I'd love for you to get your Bibles out, and we'll go together in the Book of Galatians here in just a second. Glad you got the memo on black shirts today. It was, I didn't share it, but a black shirt because, as Grant said, boy, that's a great choice for the hottest day of the year, Dad. I had my reasons. Good to see everybody this morning. We're in Galatians chapter 2, continuing on from our subject from last week. Before we get started, though, I've asked Stephen if he would to lead us in a word of prayer. Stephen?
Father, we take it seriously when we open your word to find what you want us to know. We thank you, Father, that this morning we will hear your word spoken to us, verified by your Holy Spirit, Father, for us to live for Jesus. In his name we pray.
Amen. Thank you very much. So, Galatians chapter 2 introduces us to the idea that the Apostle Paul saw a big problem come up once in the churches of Antioch. And he talks about how the idea in verse 11 that Peter was involved in this. And we talked last time about the significant danger of the idea of this cliquishness that was developing amongst the brethren, where they were dividing themselves into two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles. And I mentioned to you before that one thing seems to be that probably both parties thought that was a little easier than trying to work to get along as one church. And so this was a very big problem that had come up. After class last week, I got some good questions about this, and it got me to thinking and doing a little more studying on this too, about the nature of how this works. You probably know that there are some brethren that see that the idea of even having Bible classes might be stepping into cliquishness. And so the question comes up, well, what about having a ladies class or a men's class or having Bible classes in different groups like that? It was a really good question. And to kind of delve into that, to understand that, when we're talking about cliques here, we're talking about the idea of an intentional and total exclusion. The idea of saying that my intention and purpose is that I just want to be around people like me. I don't want to facilitate, the total relationship of me with everyone in the church. Instead, I'm content if the only people that I spend time with are the people that are in my demographic. They're, my age, my group. Just spend time with that group, even to the degree that the church facilitates that. We have to be careful with this, because when we talk about the ideas of our dividing up for Bible classes, we try to say that we would never divide our assembly of worship. And we would go to 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and talk about the dangers of division there. But even then, we still have to have some care about how we're even divided up into our Bible classes. It is something just to think about and to appreciate. Do we have the authority to do that? Is that appropriate? We can appreciate the idea that we're not all at the same level of learning, and that, we have the young kids back here, and we appreciate that they're going to learn in a different way than the rest of us. But at the same time, as I said, it is something to appreciate too, that we do all come together at one time, and that we're all together for the worship, and that, it is a practice among some to say, well, let's get all the kids out of church. Jesus in Matthew 18, don't keep the children from coming to me. I think it's, like I said, it's an important idea that we all come together. So it's important for us to appreciate and understand that there are circumstances where brethren might be in small groups from time to time. I was thinking in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul talks about going to dinner with somebody, and we might have occasions where there's just a few of us doing something together. Maybe Al and I go out for breakfast, or, Ryan and I go out for something, go do something else, doing different things with different people. That's not the dilemma of cliquishness. The dilemma of cliquishness is if they're the only ones I do things with, and I intentionally never talk to Ralph, or I never ever reach out to Zulima, and I just kind of keep that separate separation, it's a dangerous thing. And like I said, a lot of times people have that feeling of being left out of things, which is kind of a dangerous thing, because I think sometimes that's, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think there are times where that's the case as well. So either way, it can be kind of difficult there. Tacha, what do you got?
And I think newcomers, they notice this.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to be people that say, how do I have a relationship with every member of this church? And I would say particularly to somebody who's new, to somebody who's a new convert or new to the church, that I'm particularly making an extended effort in order to engage with that person. As I said, it's not so much the idea that I can't ever do anything without every person in the church. It's the idea that I'm making an effort to have a relationship with every person in my church. And that's probably what's going on here, is that they were content to allow the church to become two different groups that were then, growing in separation and growing in ideas as well. And these were all things that were very dangerous. Go ahead.
So when I was growing up, we had the congregation that we went to, and then there was another congregation, basically the same. The people on the other side of the tracks had a different color skin.
Sure.
And they met there. And so I feel that was what Galatians is saying. Don't do.
Yeah, I agree.
Because, we all believe the same things. They came over to our gospel meetings. Yeah. We went over to their gospel meetings. We did other things together. Yeah. But we didn't worship together.
Yeah, Debbie, you're bringing up probably the best example in our cultural awareness, I'll say, because this isn't true all over the world, but it was true in the United States, and it was more true 100 years ago and 50 years ago than it was even 150 years ago. That we're talking about the idea of this division among churches based on your race, your color of your skin, and that was a pretty common thing that was, and I got to be careful to say this wasn't universal. There certainly were different places in different parts of our country, and certainly all over the world, where that wasn't nearly as prominent. But particularly if you lived, in the Southeast, or Debbie mentioned where she grew up, where I grew up, that was the case. There were a division like that. That would certainly fit to what Paul is being critical about. That those kinds of divisions exist. And I'll be honest, how do you fix that? Especially after 10, 20, 30 years have gone by, it takes a lot of conscious effort. And sometimes congregations, in the end, to say, hey, we've done this for 50 years, it actually just makes sense to keep doing it. It's not great. But like I said, the problem is it does appeal to the flesh. The idea of I just want to be at the place where the people are the most like me. And that's certainly a very worldly, fleshly way of looking at it. And then we allowed that division to go on. Like I said, I say we allowed. We got to be careful here. We don't talk about the church as a universal concept. So I got to be careful to say it isn't like we allowed it, but that it wasn't something that more people were talking about in those times is unfortunate. Becky?
What do you think about the congregations like we had at Forest Grove before merging, where we had the language barrier? So we would have the Spanish-speaking service and we would have the English version.
You were asking me what I think is the toughest question in this subject.
We felt like we were one congregation, but I will admit I never went, not once, to the Spanish-speaking congregation or meeting.
And Becky, I would love to wish you hadn't asked me this almost, because it is a tough question. And I don't think that there is an easy answer on this. I would love to say, what the ideal would be is if, and here's the thing, we need to think like this because, the dynamic of our country changes and language changes. And we ought to think more about the idea of, it'd be useful if more of us, we're more fluent in other languages, Spanish being the one that I'm thinking of course. Would we be willing if, we saw a large group of people come to us, join us, and they only spoke Spanish? How many of us would say, I better learn Spanish? I would love it if that was our attitude. I don't know if that would be our attitude. It would, because it's tough. It's a lot to ask. But I would love that. I think that would be a great thing for us to do. But it would also be a very, very, very hard thing to do. So going back to Becky's question, what do you do in a circumstance like that? Well, probably the way it got handled there is as good as any. The idea of where, but of course, here's the thing. You also had at the time a preacher that was utterly fluent in 2 languages, so it made it a lot easier. If you didn't have that, you might have been better to have 2 congregations if you couldn't have that fluidity between the 2 where you had a connection. That being said, the chief goal is if we have 1 congregation with 2 languages, we should all be working to make that work out, to make that successful.
I wonder if that doesn't fall into the expediency.
I absolutely it does. So in fact, Becky, you're 100%. So I know a brother in California where their congregation meets at like 11, and then a second Spanish-speaking only congregation meets at 2, and they had talked about should we be 1 congregation, but in the end, the preacher didn't speak Spanish, the elders didn't speak Spanish, so they said, we just don't have the ability, and we can work to have that ability, but, we just don't have the ability to oversee, that kind of dynamic. And so they decided, let's just maintain 2 congregations that utilize the same resources. I think that was the expedient choice for them. If you have a high level of bilingualism, I think it is much better to have 1 congregation where people, because like I said, one of the things is, it's really great when brethren can say, we may speak a different language, but we're brethren, that glorifies Christ more than anything, not more than anything, but in a great way. So it's a really great thing to do. But like I said, that takes a lot of work. It takes uniquely qualified people that can participate. You had at the time you had Jim Kent, you had Guillermo, you had people that could easily go back and forth with that. And hopefully, like I said, it would be an attitude of people to say, we're all brethren, we all work together. It really does hit that. So
translation screen.
Oh yeah, that like I said, there's a lot of little tricks today that we can do and make that even easier. It's real easy to run something into 2 languages and distribute it, and we can all be on the same page. There's a congregation in Southern California, another one where I want to say that they're a bilingual group where they're all together. So for singing, they're singing in 2 languages, which doesn't always work great, doesn't always sound great, but that's again the expedient choice they have to make. And I have to be careful to say that is such a complicated question that probably there's no black and white answer that's universal. I would say we should be working on it, but language is probably the one realistic barrier that isn't something other than, like I said, all these other barriers are things that are just in our mind. But language is probably the one that's not just in our mind. We have to make some calculation about, how that works. So it's a really interesting question. I see a couple of hands up, and I'm going to grab them. I see, starting over here, get some comments. Do you have something to add to it?
Just real quick, I wanted to say the first step of salvation is to hear the word. If you can't understand the word.
Right, yeah. We talk about what was the gift of tongues for. It was probably to overcome this dilemma, this very dilemma. I'll start with Mar.
Yeah, going to Florida, when we visit there, we've been to 2 congregations like half of the congregation were Spanish-speaking people, and their singing is, they alternate English and Spanish,
interesting,
and
okay.
it sounds so beautifully.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just so sweet of both trying to learn English and trying to learn. Although their classes, they separate. They have during the class, they separate, but then their worship is together.
Yeah. See, and again, I think it makes sense for classes to be separate and to be apart from that. I think that you said it's sweet. It's just a great way to demonstrate, the unity of Christ can overcome a lot of things. And like I said, I just have a lot of appreciation. We can add something to it.
And I come from a country that, whenever we have a visitor, then the speaker speaks English, and then there's a translator.
Yeah. Well, one thing that is, that the American culture is Americans aren't crazy about other languages. We're kind of funny like that. Most countries, you learn 2 or 3 languages and you're used to jumping around. Usually because most countries, you're surrounded by people that speak other languages all the time, and we're not necessarily in that same situation, so it's a little different. But the point is that we're not, American culture doesn't embrace that nearly as well. And I think sometimes churches struggle to embrace that. Like I said, if I said everybody, hey, guess what? We're gonna start all learning Spanish next week. I imagine a lot of people would say, oh, I don't know about that. I don't know if I can do that. I certainly don't think I want to do that. I can appreciate that would be, a lot of people would struggle with that. It would be a big struggle. It'd be a great thing. Right now, we don't need it. We've in the past tried to kind of reach out and see what we could draw in as far as Spanish speaking, and I look at a lot of people like Vivian or Tacho that helped with that work. With the hope that maybe we could move that direction one day, but it's still something we have to think about. It's something I would hope is in the back of your mind all the time about if we want a congregation to be here in 30 years, we have to be thinking about things that we would be willing to do to make that happen, and that's an important idea. Al, go ahead.
Along with Becky, when we had the Spanish-speaking service in the afternoon, we had Romanita and Ishmael. And some of us would go, and we would sing and try and learn. And Jim Kent had classes where we were trying to learn Spanish. It was very difficult.
Yeah.
But at the end of the service, you've been there with them, and then you get up and you smile and you shake their hand.
Right.
And we were there to support them. They were, it was pretty supportive.
Yeah.
But on your other, about having groups of people that kind of hang out together, 40 years ago, Forest Grove was a lot of carpenters and plumbers, skilled men, but very little college education.
Interesting.
And then you were at Beaverton, just 2 miles
Right,
away. They
right.
were all educated, college educated, and there was quite a difference in the two congregations.
Yes, yeah.
And that was because of education.
Yeah. That's a very, Al made a very astute observation, something that I think even when our congregation became our congregation, we saw kind of a general, distinction of that kind of idea coming together. And, Al, that's a great observation of how that could be an issue that we have to overcome of different skills, different abilities, different, professions. You see this sometimes in congregations. We don't have any military bases nearby, but in congregations we have lots of men coming in from the service, and you have some men who are, those of you in the military would appreciate, you have officers, you have enlisted men, and in the military, those two groups don't mix. But in the church, that we're supposed to have this sense of that, and sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle. I've seen sometimes that kind of creates some, difficulty of saying that I have to leave something at the door and come in and be somebody different.
And the elders were, and some of the parents, like Darlene and David Steele. Darlene's parents would pick us all up in a van, tallest in Beaverton.
Yeah.
All the kids would climb in. We'd all go to Mount Hood and play in the snow together.
Mm-hmm.
So we were growing up, visiting some of those as a group of teenagers.
Yeah.
So that got us mixed up a little bit.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, like I said, this is a tricky thing where you do have to be mindful of the fact that I'm definitely, if I speak one language and Josie speaks another, we're definitely going to end up talking mostly with people that we're comfortable to talk to, because of the difficulty there. That's only natural, but Josie and I would need to be mindful of the fact that we're always going to work to be more than that. Maybe Josie is most of the week she's with these group of Christians that communicate best with her, but the rest of the time she's consciously trying to make it a point. And you can see kind of like with the Galatians, it might have been a sense where, hey, I'm gonna have a potluck Saturday, and all the Jewish brethren say, we're used to not doing anything on Saturday, and that's kind of hard for us to break. And so maybe those Gentiles did do a little more on a Saturday than the Jewish brethren did. And maybe they said, well, then let's do it Sunday or Monday, or, they might have tried to make that exception. I would hope that's the case. But like I said, you'd have to really be thoughtful. And that maybe again, the biggest idea we have to say to ourselves is we have to be very thoughtful. Our intent and our purpose is unity and togetherness. And we should do our very best to kill exclusion and being, this idea of cutting people out, that relationship has to be a total one. Ryan, you had your hand up for a while. Appreciate your patience.
I didn't even know when I've gone to Europe. Sometimes I just had someone whisper in my ear at the gas station.
Oh, yeah.
Services too. So
Yeah.
they've done several ways. So it seems like in Switzerland it's almost bilingual.
Yeah.
In Austria, people whisper in my ear.
Yeah,
Tell me what
yeah.
translation was.
Yeah. It's interesting. And again, it goes to what Mars said, that in a lot of countries, they are a lot better about being able to switch in language. So Wendy told me the story that she went, Wendy, there she is. And Wendy had made the story to me that when she was in Czech Republic, I think, that they switched the services over just for her. I think another place they had asked, well, are you comfortable in our language or another? And they actually, everybody switched just for the visitor. That blew me away that they did that. But they also had the skill to do that. But again, I think it was a great example of that. Grant, I'll make this our wrap-up question.
I was just going to say, we have the example in like 1 Corinthians 14, and there he's talking about, speaking in tongues and spiritual gift, but I think you can apply the same thing to just languages of having an interpreter there to make sure that everybody can understand.
Yeah. Well, and so here's what's really tricky, and I like that. That's a good example to say there had to be an example. He even talks about you need to sing with understanding, pray with understanding. That's your balance, right? You're trying to say, on the one hand, certain things are going to be different. On the other hand, we're supposed to have an understanding. I might even go back to Becky's original point to say, at what point do we cease trying to be one congregation overcoming this and become two congregations with two languages? And that kind of might go back to the idea of, just how thoroughly equipped are we to overcome that. So, Becky, that was a fantastic question. I didn't have a good answer for it, but it certainly it shows the idea that there's a lot to think about on this issue, and I appreciate that. We'll go ahead and move on. I want to kind of we talked about the idea of in what ways can associations or lack of associations cause error. I know we've kind of really covered this already, this being our key question. And we talked about the idea that the Apostle Paul was criticizing Peter because of his, and it's interesting, he wasn't even teaching something. It was the fact that Peter was no longer, it says, verse 12, he would, with certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. When they came, he withdrew and separated himself. It's kind of interesting to say all Peter is really doing is just not stamping up and doing what he needs to do. And so in what ways can an association or a lack of association cause error? So we've kind of talked around that, but anybody have some specific points to consider here? Specific ways to consider. Lamar?
I think one of the key things to take away from this context is that our silence can actually communicate that something is right or isn't right.
Right.
It can actually be contrary to God's law.
All right, so that is actually a fantastic point, and I like the idea of the danger of the lack of association or the lack of standing up for something. That Lamar's point is that sometimes our silence communicates a great deal. If somebody says or does something that's objectionable, that's contrary to the law of Christ, and nobody wants to say anything or stand on that. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Corinthians were critiqued for that, right? They were told, you aren't doing anything about a man who's living in sin. And he says, that's to your shame. You should be ashamed of yourselves for not doing that. I realize that a lot of times, let's say we're in a class situation like this and a comment's made and somebody says, oh, that's way off, we're kind of waiting to see, First of all, we're thinking, well, what did he mean? There are times where being thoughtful and putting your thoughts together is good. But it's also important. This is something we always talk to our teachers that, somebody throws out a bad idea, figure out a way to get that stamped out quick, to kind of bring that down and diffuse it as quickly as possible. And that's something we encourage teachers to always be considerate of as well. So the idea of being silent about things can be pretty dangerous. It can be an implied acceptance on a lot of occasions. And so while that's not universally true, it's generally true. I would say generally true. So I like that comment a lot. Anybody else have something else to add to this? One other thing I was thinking about is the idea that, as a church, if somebody comes to us and they seek to be a member of our body, if they are in fellowship with Christ, I would suggest, I don't know that we necessarily have much of a reason to deny membership in the body. Just like if somebody's not in fellowship with Christ, we are not permitted to allow them to keep their membership in our body. And again, that's a 1 Corinthians chapter 5 kind of conversation. But the idea is that we've allowed Christ to dictate with whom we have fellowship, because we have to, 1 John chapter 1, they have to walk in the light as we walk in the light, and that's fellowship. And fellowship is the basis of the membership we have within the church. And so we want to say that we don't make a lot of choice there, that's the dictates of Christ in those kind of conversations as well. So we have to say to ourselves, as a body, we're not to accept somebody who's not in Christ, because we're not in fellowship with them. And conversely, if we are in fellowship with them, that has to become a much more significant thing for us. Gregor, what do you got?
Well, one of the things we have to remember is it seems to be the apostasy, what I would call the apostasy of the nudge. The Catholic Church didn't show up till 300-400 years after Christ. But many of the things that did showed up long before that. And, it doesn't say we can't do this kind of logic. And even today, you can have, because it doesn't say we can't do this. Yet, what has that led to is we look around our denominations, and I think we have to make sure we are focusing on what the real gospel is, and that adding something, and when you say adding, I don't even mean necessarily that you have to do this in order to be saved. For example, circumcision that the first century dealt with. Some people were saying in order to be saved, you had to be circumcised. No, that's not true, right? But if we add things that are not necessarily salvation oriented, eventually they may become that, and that's something that we have to be cognizant of, the danger of the nudge, and trying to keep things as simple and as elegant, because the church as a whole is an elegant organization.
Yeah. It's that idea of the slightest, it goes back to Galatians 1, right? The slightest variation creates a whole different mechanism, and it's, most chefs would know if you, make substitution in the recipe, you can, truly damage the outcome of things. Mechanics know that. I mean, we all appreciate the idea when something has a very complex nature, and certainly, the work that we do in Christ has a complexity that can be damaged by, as you said, those subtle things that you called it the nudge, that can do that. So that's a good comment, Gregor. Anybody else have any other comments towards this idea of how association impacts us? Please, Stanley.
I wanted to talk about the fact that it took Paul to reprimand Peter, or even told him that what he's doing is not good. You must change your mind. Is there anything lesson that you may learn from that? Because Paul and Peter were
yes.
There were other brethren, but it took Paul to do it.
Yeah. So let's go to what Stanley asked here, Stanley's question, and we talked a little bit about this last week, Stanley. I know you were traveling, and I'm sorry about that, but it's a good enough question. Let's talk about it again just a little bit. The rebuke of Paul by Peter. So Stanley's question is, what do we draw from that? Well, last time we talked about the idea that it establishes for us that one of the big doctrines of denominations is apostolic authority, and the idea that an apostle had a degree of infallibility. So that in other words, many people would say that an apostle or the successors of apostles have an authority to dictate doctrine. I say most denominations are caught up in this because most denominations decide doctrine. I want to say there's a major denomination this past week that's voting on whether or not somebody can have an intimate relationship with somebody and not be married to them, and for us, we kind of laugh and say, well, that seems pretty settled in the Bible. But the concept that a church has the right to vote on doctrine would be coming from this idea that in some way these church leadership or this mindset has the ability whether or not to decide whether or not something's right or wrong. So going back to that, this infallibility of an apostle, if that was true, if the apostles were the ones that created doctrine, then Peter is creating doctrine and he wouldn't be rebukable. Paul would have to say, well, Peter, I can see what you're doing. And so it looks like, you might even say, your church is going to be a church that's divided between Jew and Gentile. But Paul instead rebukes him and says, what you're doing is wrong, contrary to the law of Christ. And that actually becomes a big idea as you move through chapter 2 and 3 about the law of Christ and that we're all subject to it. Apostles are subject to it too. There's no infallibility here. And Peter had strayed and was in error. And so the first point I say is that this teaches us that the doctrine of Christ is established not by the apostles, but by Jesus. Now, the apostles gave it to us. In fact, it's called the apostles' doctrine because they're giving it to us. But just like if, I always say, it calls it the apostles' doctrine. If I said, hey, Jenica, would you grab Brian's Bible? She'd say, well, he means the one up here because this is the Bible I use or the one that I'm speaking from. That's why it's called the apostles' doctrine. They're delivering it. But it comes from Christ. Galatians 2 is telling us this. Galatians 2 is revealing to us that the doctrine the apostles preach comes from Christ. What was Paul's statement back in chapter 1? He says, verse 11 and 12, I didn't receive this doctrine from man. It comes from Christ. And so the idea is, Paul can't create doctrine. Peter couldn't create doctrine. They could only present the doctrine that Christ had given. And nobody had any authority to change that doctrine afterwards. So number one, to Stanley's question, it establishes for us the idea that the doctrine of Christ can't even be changed by an apostle. And hence you get Paul's statement when he says, even if we, verse 8 of chapter 1, even if we or an angel from heaven give you another gospel, they're accursed. We, the apostles. So Paul says, if Paul shows up and tells you something new, you don't say, well, Paul's an apostle, he has the right. We say, no, that's another gospel. And we got to be careful about that. So that's the first point. Now, the second point I'll add to this is to say, and Stanley, you kind of asked this about, did it require an apostle to rebuke an apostle? I think that kind of is the second idea. Well, I will say, in part, I don't have necessarily a black and white answer because I don't have, because we don't have apostles today, there wasn't really much of a connection for that. Now, I'll pause, though, and I'll go back to Matthew chapter 18. And I'll say in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is talking there about, verse 18, he's talking about the authority of the apostles, talking about this very subject we're talking about right now. In Matthew 18, verse 18, assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. How do we know this is the apostles? Well, for one thing, he said this to Peter back 2 chapters before this. He called it the keys of the kingdom. And he said, this is your authority. Now, New King James says you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. Probably the New American Standard says it's a little better when it says has been loosed in heaven. So in other words, it's the idea of, heaven is the source. Earth, here is the manifestation of that. But the whole concept is, he says this requires, this is your authority. But it doesn't allow them, this doesn't go beyond them saying, well, I can just choose to do something. Like I said again, this passage doesn't mean Peter could just say, you know what? My mind, I think the best way to go is to have a Jew and Gentile church. He has no authority to do that. He's only allowed to bind the law of Christ and to loose the things that Christ has loosed. Now, I'll add to that the next verse. He says, again, I say to you that if 2 or 3 of you on earth agree concerning anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Now, by the way, I'll pause for a second. A lot of times this verse we think, well, this is talking about a church. It's not. Because what's the context? The apostles. Yeah, he's talking about the apostles and the concept that the apostles had a collective, and to Stanley's question, it might be to say the apostles had a collective requirement to kind of critique each other, to work together in that sense, and to have that sense of doing these things. So it may well be the case that what we're seeing in Galatians 2 is 2 or 3 apostles coming together and not agreeing on things. Back in chapter 1, we saw the apostles come together and they all agreed. Paul says, I want to make sure I wasn't running in vain. Now we see this coming different. I want to add one more thing, and then I see I've got some hands up, so I'll grab them here in a second. The last thing is to say this. Could anybody have rebuked Peter? I have to be careful because, like I said, not having apostles today, I could say, Stanley, I don't even have to answer that because I don't have apostles. But I think the answer is yes, based on what Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where Paul tells Timothy that if an elder is sinning, you remember what he says? Rebuke him before all. And what I think is interesting, if he's sinning, rebuke him for all, is that's kind of what Paul is doing. Paul doesn't say, Peter, come aside, I'm going to tell you privately you're doing something inappropriate. He rebukes him in front of everybody. And why is that necessary when somebody is in any leadership role? Well, if they're doing something, if Brian is the evangelist, or if Terry, let's say Terry is one of our elders, and if Terry were an elder and he was doing something, everybody look at Terry, and Terry's doing something inappropriate. What is the natural feeling people get from that? Well, Terry's one of our elders. If he's doing it, it must be okay. So the Bible makes it clear that if somebody's doing something and they're in that kind of authority or position, and it's wrong, they have to be rebuked in front of everybody. I would have to say, Terry, that's wrong, in front of everybody, or Terry would come up and say, I was wrong, in front of everybody, because his doing it, he's meant to be an example we follow. So Peter is meant to be an example. So my feeling is 1 Timothy 5 would suggest probably anybody could have rebuked him for that transgression from the law of Christ. It would have had to be from the law of Christ. Now the trick is, at that time, the law of Christ is primarily being delivered by word of mouth. There wasn't let me show you a 1 Timothy 5 kind of moment that they could have had with Peter. So it's a tricky question. It's a great question, Stan. Greg, you've been real patient, and then I'll grab Ron here in a second.
Actually, it was a follow-up question, but you kind of answered it with the elders that are rebuking it publicly. But the responsibility of the congregation to examine the elders' behavior, even after they become an elder, is really important.
Yeah.
And it's not just don't question them because they're
right.
That was my
yeah.
question.
I will say that I think 1 Timothy 5 is trying to, and if you disagree with this, that's okay, because like I said, I'm going to try to qualify what I'm saying. I do believe 1 Timothy 5 is trying to create a process for how those kind of complaints or accusations flow. That, in other words, to somebody who has that kind of authority, you bring it not necessarily directly to them. Matthew 18 says your brother sins against you, go to them. But in that case, it says that he says to the evangelist receives 2 or 3 accusations, before he considers them. That if it's the case that somebody says, hey, I think the elder's doing something wrong, it might be that 1 Timothy 5 is saying, why don't you talk to the preacher about it first and tell him you think there's something wrong. And I see that as successful for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of times there's just complaints about leadership. I just didn't like something. And it's a good place for that complaint to be smoothed out. But number two, then it sets up the next stage of the process that if they are sinning, this has been done in a way that then allows this second portion, which is to rebuke in front of all, to be brought forward. So I think that there is actually a process there that's being described as to how the congregation handles that kind of thing. But as I said, if somebody disagreed with me, I could understand why. Greg, does that kind of go the direction you were thinking? Ron, thanks so much, and then I'll go to Larry.
Male comes into Christ, he's a brother.
Right.
He's an apostle, elder, or whatever. 17 says, if a brother sins, you can. Say, this is no. So I would say that anybody can rebuke him.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and particularly, and I'll be careful to say that Matthew 18, a lot of translations say if he sins against you, and this would be the difference between if he wrongs me versus he's doing something wrong. If as I said, if he's doing something wrong, it might be that conversation where I take it to the evangelist and I say, I think he's doing that. But if he wrongs me, I should go talk to him. If he insults me, I should talk to him about it. I do think that there's a distinction there in those kinds of conversations. So it's a good point to say, in that personal point, Matthew 18 would seem to give that authority to be rebuked there too. So, and again, I would not want to, I would not want anybody to walk away thinking there was ever a time where somebody's sinning and they get away with it. That's utterly not what the Bible wants us to think about. Larry, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking of your association, and what changes from one congregation to another is the 2 and 3-letter words can change a whole sentence to mean something totally different than what was stated by the apostles. And then somebody runs with that, it changes the whole concept.
So, it's interesting, Larry, to see how 2 different congregations, and we talked a moment ago about the expediency. Christ's solution to that is actually pretty great, and that is the autonomy of a local church, so that we're not, as a congregation, required to figure out what a congregation in another community or even down the street We're not expected to figure out what it is that they do so we can reconcile ourselves with them. And that's pretty fantastic. So, as far as I'll say this carefully, as far as we as a body are concerned, we're the only church we think about, Now, you as an individual Christian, if you're Lamar and you travel a lot, you might be a congregation that you visit a lot and you say, I have a close relationship. There's congregations I'll be visiting this summer. I have a close relationship with them. Paul had close relationships with different congregations. You as individuals will have that. And you may need to make a discernment to say, I don't think this group is right anymore. And by the way, that's where association also needs to be reminded of, is that Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11 says, have no, the word partnership is used here. Some Bibles say fellowship. Have no partnership with works of darkness, but rather expose them. And so the thought there is to say, if I have a relationship with, personally, I have a relationship with another congregation, but I know they're doing something wrong, what does the Bible command? I'm not supposed to have a partnership. I'm not supposed to have some relationship. And the reason why I'm distinct to say the word is partnership there is it's talking about your personal relationship. You expose it. You instead say, this isn't right. This is something you shouldn't be doing. And that's the expectation there. But as a congregation, this is where the beauty of autonomy comes in. I don't have to reconcile with another group. We as a body don't have to reconcile with another body because it would be too hard. Going back to expediency, we saw this during COVID where different congregations had to handle COVID different ways. And there was a lot of times where somebody said, well, we wouldn't handle it that way. And the point is, maybe we wouldn't. It doesn't matter. That's the beauty of autonomy. We don't have to figure out, why somebody else made the decision they make. We just have to make our decision. And so it's a great, great observation to that point. Grant, I think you had your hand up earlier. Okay, George, then.
1 Corinthians 5, the church congregation has a responsibility to confront error, whether it's the preacher or a member.
Yeah.
I can't just let it go.
Yeah. I would say a passage like 2 John, the whole book of 2 John is about don't receive somebody who doesn't teach the doctrine of Christ. Now, receive as a teacher, I would say. It's talking about there. But that's a whole congregation expectation. A lot of times we just kind of say, well, that falls to the elders or to the evangelist. But, in 1 Corinthians 5, the whole congregation is a part of the process of taking care of that. So all of us have that responsibility. Can't pass it on to anyone else. Stephen, go ahead.
I like what Peter wrote. Our dear brother Paul also wrote to you with that wisdom that God gave him.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably after that event.
By the way, so Stephen has taken us over to 2 Peter chapter 3. That verse is important because it makes it clear that Peter didn't hold a grudge. Peter doesn't say, that Paul is, Peter saw Paul as a fellow worker from, even with this rebuke. And by the way, that's a great attitude to think about, that Peter could be rebuked in front of everybody by Paul and still commend Paul as a person you should listen to. That's the attitude we ought to have, that if I got rebuked, if Isaac rebukes me in front of everybody and I'm embarrassed, Peter had to be embarrassed. But still to say, boy, you guys ought to listen to Isaac. He knows what he's talking about. That's the right spiritual attitude that ought to be conveyed there. The next point I wanted to cover here as we go through here is that whenever Paul goes on here, he starts talking about the idea of being a Jew, living in the manner of the Gentiles, not as Jew, but now you want to compel Gentiles to live like a Jew. What? So he says, in other words, you're no longer living like a Jew. What would be the way he's not living like a Jew? Well, he's probably not, going through the Jewish practices of worship anymore because he worships like a Christian. He was told in Acts chapter 10, arise, kill, and eat. So maybe he's not eating like a Jew anymore. It's hard to say. But, there's a lot of things he's doing that are no longer that law. But he's saying you seem to be by implication, not by statement, just by implication, wanting Gentiles to start living like Jews. He says this is a kind of a hypocritical thing that you're going through. He says and by the way, verse 15 is a really tricky one when he says, we're Jews by nature. We're not sinners of the Gentiles. That's what? But the idea, like I said, let's not read too far into this when he's just saying, if you were raised as a Jew, you were raised knowing God. If you're raised as a Gentile, that's probably not true. It's not meant to be too specific of a statement. Great, go ahead.
I have a kind of a small thing, but in case someone else looking at this is a little bit confused like me, I noticed that maybe a translation difference. In the ESV, it ends Paul's conversation with Peter in verse 14 and has the rest of the chapter as him talking to the Galatians.
Yeah, yeah.
I was looking at the NASB, and it has the whole rest of the chapter as a single quote for that. It kind of seems like maybe this still has to be Peter talking, or Paul talking to Peter.
So there's a question about what you're saying there. So Grant's point is that verse 14 is clearly Paul saying, this is what I told Peter. Somewhere in the next few verses, probably by chapter 3 and verse 1, we know for sure, he transitions to something he's not telling Paul or Peter anymore. He's telling his audience, the Galatians. There's a lot of times where that kind of thing happens, where there's a conversation in the Bible. It starts off as a personal conversation, and then it launches into an idea. Grant, I'm not sure where that truly breaks off. I think actually verse 14 is as good a place as any, but I don't know precisely sure where he broke off and what he was saying privately or what he was saying publicly to Peter and what he's saying to the audience of the book.
It seems like from other parts of the book that usually when he's talking to the Galatians, he calls them Gentiles. Like in earlier in chapter 2, he talks about, the not being forced to be circumcised because we wanted to bring you the truth preserved.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's a good comment. We're at our time, so we're going to have to stop here. I am thinking I might move this conversation about covenants to chapter 3 instead. I'd written up in our notes to have this conversation here because of the conversation between the law of Moses, the law of Christ, and to have that. I think instead we'll go and we'll pull this out and we'll jump ahead to this part, to this part where we're talking about the idea that Christ and Moses couldn't coexist, being something, and then we'll come back to this covenant conversation in chapter 3. So we'll pick up there. Thank you all for good comments. Roy, hit the buzzers. Yeah.
Thank you for joining the Church of Christ in Cornelius, Oregon. We can be found on our website. You can scan the QR code on your screen or the CD you were given, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cornelius Church of Christ. Thank you and God bless.